Okay, so before we get going then, I just wanted to mention I'll pop the recording of the session up later on this afternoon, just in case it's useful for anyone. I will also get Copilot to tidy up a transcript of the session, and I'll also put the session summary up as well. So that might take a little bit longer, so those other two bits should be up there by tomorrow by the time those things are ready, but the recording will be up there later today, as I said, if that's of use to anyone. Before we start, really, I just wanted to say it's nice to see some familiar faces in the room. It's been quite some time since we met last, realistically. And yeah, just checking to see how people are feeling about being in the final kind of couple of months of your time with us at Swansea. So I think a few people are kind of happy at that point and it's time to leave. Potentially people are kind of feeling the same way as well. Anybody got their next year sorted as yet? Anybody going on to PGCE next year? So I know a few people are. Anybody doing the PGC at Swansea next year? No hands up that time. So anybody going to Trinity, for example, and kind of staying local? Fab, so quite a few of you. So good luck with the PGC or whatever comes next. That's okay, good morning. So what we're going to do this morning, realistically, is pick up on a couple of points that those of you who did the ALN module last year will already have heard before. So on one sense, this might be kind of a useful recap. On the same sense, it's quite warm in here, and some of you might decide to zone out and snooze for the rest of the morning as well, if this isn't quite for you. But thinking about what the assignment is for this module then, realistically, I think the first part you're looking at kind of is childhood as social construct. The second bit of it is related to thinking about how childhood has changed over time, or different aspects of childhood have changed over time, or potentially thinking about how different aspects of childhood compares nationally and internationally. So although there are a large number of topics that Michelle's looked at here, I think we were doing gender and identity last week and the week before, for example, ALN as an area might be something that could be used, I suppose, in particular in terms of that second part of the assignment. Okay, I'm quite conscious that this floor is very squeaky, so I'm trying not to move too much. Thinking about that then, I don't know how well you can see this on the screen, but I've put an example of a newspaper advert from the 1930s on the front of that PowerPoint slide there, which I think is quite an illustrative example as to how children have been perceived over time. And potentially, as we go through this morning, we'll think a little bit about whether things have changed that much or not since then. So again, as I said, I'm not sure how well you can see this. I found this a few weeks ago. I took a photo of it on my phone, and then for the life of me, I can't find where I found it from. But this is an advert from the Ovaltine company. So if you are of an age where you need a nice malty drink to help you sleep in the evening, for example, then Ovaltine is one of those key ones. Other parts of the world, somehow it's sold as an energy drink and a boost to get people going in the morning. But back in the 1930s, this was kind of being sold as a health drink. And in particular, they used to run a series of adverts about, do you know what, is your child malnourished? Is your child stunted in their physical growth? Then maybe drinking Ovaltine would be helpful. And this one, I think, is quite illustrative in terms of what we're going to talk about today, in terms of the language it's used, which, if you can see it at the top there, which has the phrase, why some children are backward. Okay, now backward was quite a common phrase in the 1930s and 1940s. An influential paper by Charles Burt in 1937, for example, was entitled The Backward Child, and talked about children today, perhaps we would see as having a learning difference, potentially an additional learning need, but talked about those children who perhaps were what was seen at the time as having 70% or so of the capacity of so-called normal children. So there used to be kind of comparisons with light bulbs, for example. So your child isn't as bright as another, they lack something. And in terms of the terminology that was used at the time, I suppose realistically this article by Charles Burt talked very much about the problem of backward children and the problem of being of great importance for the UK. And there was a few things that this article mentioned which I think still hit quite close to home today. So one of them talked about the fact that somewhere between 10 and 20% of children in school at the time could be viewed as being backward. And another term that he used, which again I think is quite illustrative, is irredeemably dull, which doesn't just express my personality, but talking about the fact that, you know what, there were some children who were so dim, who were so dull that they couldn't be fixed, was the kind of the view at the time. And talked about the fact that somewhere between 10 and 20% of children were backward. Now, when we think about figures, I'm going to stand here, that's less squeaky. Figures in England today talk about the fact about 20% of children in school have a special educational need. In Wales, we are just under 10% of children having an additional learning need. So perhaps we're still talking about the same kind of proportion of children and young people. However, the terminology that we're using is different. However, the perceptions of the terminology underpinning that, are they the same or has that changed over time? So even though today we're talking about 20% of children having SEND in England or 10% of children having ALN, are we still talking about those learners from the same kind of perspective? So have things changed? If they have, bless you, have things changed for the better? And in particular, one of the other things this article goes on to talk about is the problem of backward children. And in particular, I've written this phrase down because it won't stick in my head. Most criminals and paupers can be drawn from the ranks of this group of children. In other words, when we're thinking about backward children, or this was kind of the view in the 1930s, this is where criminals and the poorest members of society were going to come from. So there was that perception that these children were a drain on society and a drain on community. And there was no point realistically in educating some of these children, and what we're going to do is put them in institutions, for example. So, as I said, what we're going to do as we go through is kind of look to see whether that has changed, and I think it has to some extent, but maybe in other ways. Some of those ways of viewing learners are still the same. And then we're going to think a little bit upon how that might impact upon the child, how that might impact upon childhood. And I'm glad that there's more than 10 of you here this morning, as I'm going to ask you to do a bit of a task later on where there are 10 different things I want people to find out so that we can compare and contrast in terms of those. So that's kind of where we're going to go this morning, if that's okay. So what we're going to cover this morning, and again for many of you this will be kind of a recap rather than new information, but we'll think a little bit about additional learning needs. So those children who might have been seen as backwards in the 1930s, for example, they might be our ALN learners today. We'll think a little bit about labels. Again, we'd have touched on this previously. We'll think a little bit about perceptions of labels. We'll think a little bit about the impacts of those perceptions. And then towards the end, I'm also going to ask you to do kind of a global comparison task, where I'm going to give you a range of different countries from different parts of the world, and hopefully we can put together some kind of comparison table looking to see similarities and differences in terms of how children with needs are perceived and how that impacts upon childhood. So as well as the squeaky floor, that's really helpful timing next door as well. So, I've pinched this first part of the slide from one of Michelle's sessions. It might have been last week or the week before, I can't quite remember. Where Michelle, I think, was talking with you about the impact of culture. And in particular, culture in relation to gender and gender identity. And as I said, I'm not sure which one of Michelle's sessions I've pinched these quotes from, but talking about the culture we live in impacts upon how we think and how we behave, and potentially some of the tools and artefacts, including our language and our norms and values, transmit that culture gender relationally within society. So we're going to think a little bit about some of the things that impact upon societal views of ALN, SEN, and we'll broaden it out to disability as well, and think about the impacts of that. And again, this picture at the bottom, I think, recaps quite a lot of what we looked at in the Level 5 module, thinking about perceptions. So that medical model of disability or need, very much focusing on the learner or the individual as being the problem. So we focus on what they can't do, for example, and then we focus upon how we go about fixing what they can't do. And then maybe the social model, which focused a little bit more upon barriers in society and potentially took that medical model forward a little bit in terms of, yes, that person might have a physical difference or a mental difference. However, that physical or mental difference isn't what disables the individual, it's the barriers within society itself. Okay. So again, we will move on to some new stuff shortly. So again, last year we took a look at this definition, and we said in Wales then we've moved away from special educational needs to additional learning needs. This was the definition that we had. And within education in Wales over the last few years, there's been a number of key changes that have taken place to try and make schools and education and society more inclusive. So we've had the curriculum for Wales, for example, and the ALN changes. However, again, within the definition, one of the key things we still have is that comparison of children with others who are seen as being the so-called norm. On this slide, then, what you've got, again, might be a little bit small to see on the board, but if you've got the PowerPoint open, hopefully it's a little bit easier to see, is what we've got at the bottom of the screen is what's happened to the number of learners with ALN in Wales since changes have come into place. And again, thinking back to Bert's article from 1937, that 10 to 20% of children with challenges or differences. So just before the new legislation came into being, just under 20% of children in Wales were identified as having an additional need or a special educational need. Some other bits of research put this up as far as 53% in different parts of Wales, for example. And then what we've seen since the new legislation has come into being is there has been a massive drop. So realistically, the total number of learners has dropped by more than half, and we've gone from nearly 20% of learners having ALN or SEN to less than 10% of children today having ALN. The most recent figures will come out in July this year. My feeling would be that these will continue to drop further again. So why was that the case? So potentially, as we've seen before, it may be something to do with how we define learners. And this was a key bit which has created all sorts of challenges for schools in terms of understanding what this bit means. So one of the biggest differences in the definition was this bit in yellow at the end, where a learner needs additional learning provision. So when we think about what schools do, I suppose there's two different types of provision we can think about. So universal provision, this is what schools offer to everyone. And then additional learning provision might be something that's outside of what is offered to everyone. And that is quite difficult, I think, for schools to kind of conceptualise, as realistically those of you who are out on placements at the moment, for example, will have seen potentially all sorts of different types of differentiation going on in school, children being taught in kind of different classes or different units. The challenge with the definition maybe is where does that stop becoming universal and where does that become additional? And realistically at the moment we're not quite sure. So potentially, when we look at the reasons why those numbers of learners has dropped quite so dramatically, there are a number of different reasons behind that. So some people will look at that and go, well, previously we were diagnosing too many children as having needs that they didn't have. Okay, now personally I do take some kind of issue with that, as morally and ethically I don't think we would be in a position where we are diagnosing people with something that they don't have for a particular reason. However, there are all sorts of arguments depending upon what sort of newspapers or websites you look at, for example, talking about the fact that there had been a growth in diagnosis because it led to a growth in benefit claims within families, for example. So there's all sorts of newspaper articles out there talking about the fact that we've seen a massive growth in ADHD diagnosis once it was possible for parents to get a brand new BMW through the Motability disability system, for example. So there are all sorts of debates around were we over-diagnosing learners. If we look at some of the figures on the board, for example, again, I apologise, these are really small. Some of these areas, I would say, we're definitely not over-diagnosing. So we've got 460,000 children in schools in Wales currently. 10% of the UK population is expected to be dyslexic. However, when we look at the dyslexia figures, 2,300 children in Wales have a dyslexia diagnosis. So if we were diagnosing children, then potentially 46,000 learners should be on there with dyslexia. So is there an over-diagnosis of needs previously? I would take some issue with that. So what else might be going on? So potentially schools are getting better at supporting the needs of learners based on what they offer to everyone. Okay, so as we said on that last slide, if a learner doesn't need additional learning provision, then they don't have an additional learning need. So you might still be dyslexic, you might still be autistic, but if your needs are being met by what the school is offering to everyone, and they don't need to put something additional in place for you, then in terms of this definition, we don't have an additional learning need. Okay. Why then are additional learning needs and labels and definitions important? And again, we've looked at this previously, so again, apologise if you've heard some of this at least before. It depends greatly, really, in terms of where we place and how we support and how we work with different learners. Now, in schools across the Wales currently, the most recent figures, my maths isn't great, but I think we've got 1,440 schools across Wales. Okay, and the number of schools continues to drop every year as the number of children and young people in Wales continues to fall as part of our kind of generally ageing population, for example. The biggest drop currently is in primary schools. So back in 2024, there was 1,213 primary schools. We've lost 14 schools over the last academic year, for example. Okay, but we are seeing growth in other areas. So middle schools in Wales are seen as being those schools which are also called all-through schools. So those schools have got learners from the age of 3 to 16 or 3 to 19 on the same campus, for example. So quite different to what middle schools are in England and what middle schools are in America in particular. And again, challenges relate to, as we've seen before, what do we mean by learners being included? Now, one of the things that the Curriculum for Wales was meant to achieve and the ALN transformation was meant to achieve was that more learners would be supported and included in mainstream school. However, since these transformations have been put in place, the number of learners attending special schools has actually gone up. And it's risen by about 300 or 400 learners over the last couple of years. And what has also gone up, although this figure is a little bit more difficult to nail down, is the number of learners who now attend places like pupil referral units. Okay, so potentially there is still an impact in terms of labels and diagnosis on where children are taught and how that impacts upon their childhood and their life chances going forward. What we're going to move on to think a little bit about is perceptions. Now again, I apologise, I might have shown you some of these people on a slide previously, but we mentioned earlier on that all of us live in a particular society, in a particular culture, and thinking about the terminology and words that we use, for example, it does impact on our perceptions of how we view other people. And what we've got on this slide, hopefully you can see them, is 5 different people. So a mixture of kind of age, mixture of gender, mixture of ability, mixture of ethnicity, for example. And on this slide, one of these people is a philanthropist, so has made a vast amount of money and now spends their time giving it away in terms of doing good things. One of these people owns a football club. One of these people is one of the world's leading orthopaedic surgeons. One of these people is an university professor, and one of these people is a convicted criminal who was sentenced to 24 years in prison for a massive fraud scheme. So what I'd like you to think about is, very briefly really, which one of those people do you think is which? Okay, so if we say this person on the left would be person A, this person on the right would be person E. Okay, I'd like you to have a brief think about which one of those people do you think is which, and why do you think that's the case? And we look to see what is it that's influenced your perception of choosing the person that you think it is. Okay, so these are all real people. This is their real profession or real circumstances. So we've got a multi-millionaire philanthropist. And we've got someone who owns and runs a semi-professional football club. We've got a leading orthopaedic surgeon. We've got a university professor. And we've got a convicted criminal. All right. And I'd like you to think about why you pick which person for which one. Okay. So I'll give you another few seconds. Right, okay. Everybody kind of matched up a person to the picture. So the first one we'll do then is the philanthropist. So one of these is a multimillionaire who now spends their time giving away a large amount of their fortune. So do we think the philanthropist multimillionaire is person A? No takers for person A. Okay, person B? Right. Person C? Okay, so we got 1.5 hands up. Person D? Person E. Okay, so a few people there. Okay, so the philanthropist is, well done at the back, person C, who is Eddie Brown, who is a famous business person in Philadelphia in America. And he set up a finance firm, so he made millions and millions of dollars in terms of kind of hedge funds, for example. And he set up his kind of philanthropic endeavours because he grew up in extreme poverty in Philadelphia. He was orphaned as a young child. He kind of went to live with an uncle, and he was doing kind of part-time jobs from kind of the age of 8 upwards. And when he was 18, he got a scholarship to go to university. And to this day, he doesn't know who paid for him to go. So somebody in his community had kind of taken note of him and put a college fund together to send him into higher education. He then had benefited as a result, and then now kind of pays it forward back into society. Okay, so we got the philanthropist. All right, so who owns a football club? So anybody think person A? B? Okay, so we know it's not C. D? Okay, a few hands. E. Okay, so the football club owner is George Dowell. It's well done at the back again. George Dowell was an aspiring professional footballer. At the age of 17, he was involved as a passenger in a car crash and became paralysed from the chest down. He used a lot of his compensation money to buy Worthing FC Football Club, who, if anyone's interested in football, are in the National League South, so they're about 2 leagues below kind of professional football level. he bought them when I think he was 22 years old and has now led them to kind of semi-professional status. Okay, so we've done the first two. Looking at person A then, so we've got 3 left. Anybody think that person A is an orthopaedic surgeon? A few people. University professor? No one. Convicted fraudster? No. Okay, so she is Dr. Sarah Gray, the world's most tattooed doctor, as she is known, and she is a leading orthopaedic surgeon in Australia. We've then got this happy smiley chap here. So is he a university professor or is he a convicted fraudster? So anybody, so fraudster, quite a few nods. Okay, so this is Jeffrey Skilling, who used to be the CEO of Enron. So was a kind of environmental company, caused a number of disasters in America, funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into his personal bank account, where it was just arrested as a mistake, and was sentenced to 24 years in prison. And then may have seen this lady before. This is Professor Temple Grandin, who is a university professor in America in 2 different subject disciplines. So she is a professor of neurodiversity. So she is famously autistic herself. So was non-verbal up until the age of 12, for example. Her parents split up because Dad refused to have her as his daughter, realistically. And when Mum refused to institutionalise her, walked out on the family. So she is kind of a professor of neurodiversity, has written all sorts of books about the experience of being autistic, and she's also a world-leading expert in animal science and animal husbandry as well. So has done a lot to change things in a number of different fields. Okay. So, I'm not going to kind of ask you to share now, but there were all sorts of reasons potentially why you would have attributed those different roles to those different people. Okay, so maybe worth kind of thinking in the background about perceptions and biases and whether those are subconscious or not. How did you come to those decisions that you did? Okay. So again, we've touched on this previously. We've looked at different labels before. And we've said potentially thinking about how this might fit into this module a bit more specifically, maybe labels have the impact of either supporting risk or supporting resilience. So maybe for some learners and some labels, having that label might make your life more difficult. And we've talked before, for example, about the impact of any labels related to behaviour. Okay, which automatically seem to lead to increased likelihoods of exclusion from school, for example. However, there may be other labels that are seen more positively or potentially support that learner's resilience. Okay, so the fact that I have a diagnosis of something, I've now been given a label, that now might explain the challenges I experienced previously, that now might make me more resilient as a result. However, as we said, maybe it depends on the label, maybe it depends on the individual and society as well. Okay, so apologies, you've seen these labels before. I'm going to say that phrase a lot again as we go through this morning. Next task I'd like you to do briefly, if you don't mind, if maybe you're happy to kind of put yourself into some kind of groups in terms of doing this. Maybe if one of you in a group is happy to act as the scribe to kind of capture some thoughts rather than everyone have to do this individually. But on the screen there I've got a number of different terminology and labels. You will have come across these before. And what I'd like you to do on Padlet is to think about which of those labels do you think might support a positive perception. So are there some there that might be positive and might support a learner's resilience, for example? Are there some on there that are more negative and maybe could lead to increased risk? And maybe are there some on there that perhaps are a bit more neutral, or the outcome could be, it depends. All right, so a number of ones I've put up on there. If there's any others that you can think of as well, by all means add them onto those different areas. So all of these are official labels, so maladjusted, for example. So we don't have that label in use anymore. Maladjusted was the label in the 1970s for children with behavioural difficulties that we'd see today. Okay, and the definition was this is a child who knows the difference between right and wrong, but has chosen not to behave in the right way. So very much attributing that child as being deliberately naughty. So is that a positive or negative or neutral label? Dyslexia, does that have an impact in terms of positivity or negativity? Educationally subnormal, okay, kind of unpicking that. Subnormal, below the level of normal children that we would expect to educate. So is that positive or negative? This one perhaps is open to debate more recently, neurodiverse. So neurodiverse, an increasingly common term that's used, seen as being inclusive of everyone. So all of us on the planet fit within this umbrella of neurodiversity because we're all different and we all think and work differently. However, underneath that broad term, we talk about people who are neurotypical and neurodivergent. So we've still got the majority of typical and those people who are divergent, they differ in some way. So is that positive? Is it negative? Is that one maybe depends a little bit more? In Wales then we've got additional learning needs. Is that positive or not? In Scotland we use additional support need. So rather than focusing upon the child and their needs, we focus more on the support that's required for that child. So does that give a different perception towards that person? Next one, mentally retarded. Okay, so again, we don't have that one anymore, but had been very common. Handicapped was the term that we replaced with special educational needs in the early 1980s, for example. Crippled, so you could get a diagnosis of crippled up until the early 1980s. You could be taught in a school like the Cripples Home for Boys, for example. Visually impaired, emotional disturbance, autism spectrum disorder, and then we got special school and pupil referral unit. So if one of you in your kind of cluster is happy just to pop something up on that Padlet, any there that you think are positive, any that are negative, any that are kind of neutral, and then I'm only going to give you a few moments to do this, I apologise, but if there's any other labels that you can think of that you want to add to those columns as well, please feel free to pop them on. Okay. So I'll give you a few minutes again if you're happy to post those onto that kind of top line on the Padlet, please.
Yeah, and it wasn't like I obviously left something out. I don't think that's in the headline. Okay, this notification is not.
Yeah. Say that again. By all means, yeah, it is toasty in here. Yeah. if it does open, feel free. All right. Yeah. Thank you for opening those. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of minutes. Okay, so listening around the room, quite a few people are asking questions like, can you think of a good one? Okay, so that does kind of, sorry, it was you, beginner, but that does give you a good idea, doesn't it, that there are, maybe it's easier to think about those that are perhaps more negative in terms of perceptions compared to those that are more positive.
I've just done like classes. I haven't written literal.
So, thank you very much for those of you who've posted so far. Okay. So, polite ladybug then, thank you very much. So, maladjusted as being an example of a negative one because it does apportion fault on the child. They've chosen to misbehave, they've chosen to be naughty. Because they've chosen to be naughty, they're not behaving in a way that we want. There's not a lot of positivity to take about that one. Dyslexia may be neutral, okay? Somebody is dyslexic or they're not. Does that have a positive or negative impact? Educationally subnormal, again negative, because it highlights that difference. Neurodiverse, neutral. ALN, neutral. Okay, thank you. So, dependable koala. So some of these seen as being more positive. So neurodiverse. So potentially more positive because it includes every single one of us on the planet. Dyslexia may be positive because it's kind of a scientific need. Visually impaired, ALN, for example. And then those that are more negative, again, may be a negative because they can be used against people. Maybe what they do is highlights difference and otherness, which leads to stigma, for example. So maladjusted, educationally subnormal, mentally retarded, for example, and then putting those locations in negative as well. The fact that you've gone to a special school or pupil referral unit might highlight stigma because you are different. You are not seen as being normal mainstream children in some way. So thank you very much for posting that. And then the observant peacock one, okay, so again some similarities but some differences here as well. So in terms of positive, so again neurodiversity coming up, but this individual or group has put the needs in here as well. Whilst the negative, again, does have the kind of similarities in terms of school, neutral in terms of being handicapped. And then the enthusiastic McCall, not seen that one before. The label special implies that people with ALN are different, bless you, and because people are different, they are viewed as being abnormal in some way. So thank you very much for posting those. So potentially then the perspectives of labels does impact upon children and their childhood and their experiences. Okay. I'm going to go on to a slight tangent for the next couple of minutes or so and think a little bit about what informs and what is kind of perpetuated within our culture. Going to move slightly away from kind of ALN and SEN and think about disability more broadly. I'm going to ask you shortly to think a little bit about characters from books or films or TV programmes, for example, that may be disabled or may have an additional need or a special educational need. And we're going to unpick a little bit about what that character portrays and how they are viewed and how that might impact upon society. However, before we go on to that, there's all sorts of characters at the bottom of the screen that, again, I don't know how well you can see those, But one of the things that we see very often in films in particular is that character which is the disabled villain. So that disabled villain character is something that has been common in films, books, TV, in kind of recent years, but also goes back into kind of further literature and is possibly there within religion to some extent as well. And when we think about some of these characters, if you can kind of pick them out on there, for some reason they have been given a disability which potentially portrays their otherness or difference from society. And one of the things possibly that comes out is that that feeling of difference or otherness has led to some kind of rage which leads to them wanting to seek revenge on society, which is why they become the villain in the story. And potentially in many of these kind of characters and backgrounds as well, there is that link between disability or needs as being a punishment for something. So potentially that person is disabled or has a need because this is a punishment for previous deeds. So potentially this disabled villain trope, as it's called, helps to perpetuate within society and culture that kind of feeling of otherness or difference or wrongness in relation to disability. And what I've got on this slide, you should be able to see these a little bit better, are some examples again of characters with disabilities or needs from more recent films, for example. So we've got Forrest Gump, we've got Charles Xavier from X-Men, we've got Raymond Bobbitt from Rain Man, and we've got Freya. Has anybody seen this programme recently? I can't remember what it's called. I've written it down somewhere. We Might Regret This, for example, which is a comedy on BBC at the moment. So in terms of how people today with needs are portrayed in films, again, we've got that kind of disabled villain type character. However, we are potentially increasingly seeing disability viewed as being more positively. So if, I'm assuming, and that's a big assumption potentially, have we all seen Forrest Gump? Yeah. Okay, so thinking about Forrest Gump, for example, what would you suggest would be an area of need that he might have? Okay, so today potentially we might look at Forrest Gump as having some kind of learning difference. Potentially we might look at Forrest Gump as being on the autistic spectrum. Potentially at the start of the film as well, he's got the leg braces on, which kind of come off as he's being chased by the people in the car following him. So maybe some kind of physical need as well, so maybe polio, for example, or cerebral palsy, although I think he says something in the film about his legs being strong but his back was crooked, so maybe we're looking at something like scoliosis, for example, in terms of having a physical need as well. So we've got Charles Xavier then in his kind of wheelchair, physical disability as a result of fighting against supervillains in the X-Men, I think. I'm not a big sci-fi fan, but I think that's his origin story. Raymond then from Rain Man, we've mentioned him before, that kind of autistic savant with that extraordinary ability to count numbers. And then from the more recent BBC comedy series, this is a character called Freya, who is a tetraplegic young woman. So she has an issue with her neck, which means she has limited mobility in each of her 4 limbs, for example. And within this TV programme, it follows her. She moves from Canada, I think, to London to move in with her older boyfriend. And it's about kind of living and dating and being a part of a modern society whilst having a disability. So maybe it gives quite a bit of a different perspective to that experience. So what I'm going to ask you to do now, if you don't mind, again, if you're happy to do this in the same kind of clusters as you did before, or if you want to do this individually, that's also entirely fine. I'd like you to think about a character from film or TV or books, for example, where potentially this character does have a disability or an additional need or a special educational need, And what I'd like you to do on Padlet is going to take you to the same Padlet that you were working on before, but you will see there's a second row that you're going to post something onto now. So how is that person perceived? What might be their needs and characteristics? And then maybe is there something there based on that character which shows us how people with needs or disabilities are perceived? Okay, so it could be one of the characters on the screen. It could be somebody, if you can see anyone on there, for example, in terms of those kind of largely Bond or superhero villains or kind of horror characters. Or maybe there are other characters that you've come across from books or TV, so it could be Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, for example, which maybe is a slightly different portrayal of autistic spectrum disorder compared to Raymond from Rain Man, for example. So if I give you 5 minutes or so, can you identify a character? Can you briefly note what their kind of needs are? And can you also briefly note what or how they are perceived? Okay. So it doesn't have to be from TV or film, it could be from book character, for example. So if any of you read Mice and Men in school, for example, it could be, what's his name, Lemmy. Okay, it could be Tiny Tim from Charles Dickens, for example.
So I'll be the first and then I'll need you and it means it's not actually it's just like me bringing stuff to my DBS. So I'll be asking you
you might say Sheldon, that's right.
I won't ask you to kind of share
I just find it on your
Are you okay with the sun training?
It's not just Sean Murphy, my granddad for international women. I don't know. Yeah, but I need to write it down. Keep it small. Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm done. I have actually that's all I know. But do they know like you can do it about this is just a lot of patients
I was waiting to hear back
Yeah, she's in a wheelchair.
Is she a personnel worker?
And she kind of puts everything on the fact. She kind of puts all of her bad actions on the fact and finding out like it's easy. This kind of trains being in a wheelchair it gives us a good quality of life. Every bad action she ever did in the film, on the fact she was the fact she's totally Sounds like stuff from the games to do.
The baby.
I'll say it's awful.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you don't know I used to find out
It's just like a bunch of kids find a treasure map in like their atlas and they go on a treasure hunt and they end up on a ship. Yeah, they end up on a ship and it's him and his I guess. It's probably in London and they kind of treat him like technology I think. And then in the end they take it off with them because the dog's lost essentially. Slime is just the cutest little guy.
I don't really stay here. Like I don't
What the girl has.
how he is. He's just I would like it. I would like the older brothers, they do like the music, and I do I like
The older brother do need, obviously, these are all children, and this is old still. Also, the actors are now aged up.
Right, okay. Thank you very much for those of you that have posted so far. Quite a wide range of people being talked about. You can definitely see the different cultural references in terms of the TV programmes that people have noted compared to the ones that I might watch possibly. But thinking about Polite Ladybird, so Sam from Atypical, okay, so looking at growing up autistic from his perspective, that's a nice character. Very much of my generation, Sloth from the Goonies, okay, so yeah, very much thinking about his experience, kind of chained up with the family, very much that kind of figure of fun, who kind of fights back potentially. Lenny from Mice and Men, so a nice one there from literature. So again, that kind of perception that he needs that constant care and supervision is viewed as being dangerous because of his difference. Dr. Sean Murphy from The Good Doctor, I know a few people had mentioned that one, for example. So quite interested in having that TV programme where the character who is different is the main character, rather than perhaps a sidekick or shows the difference. We've also got Nessa from Wicked on there as well, thank you very much. And then from Disney, so we got Captain Hook, and then we've also got Scar as well in terms of thinking about how they look differently and also picking up on their personality as well. So thank you very much for sharing those. So it's coming up to 5 to 12. At this point, do you want to have a comfort break for 10 minutes or so, escape from the direct sunlight, go and get a drink, come back? So I'll pause the recording, then if we look to start back at about 12:05, and then what we'll do is think a little bit about how perceptions compare globally. Okay, so thank you very much for coming back, that is appreciated. So realistically then, before we stopped for a break, we were thinking a little bit about how perceptions of ALN or SEN or disability might be informed within our culture or potentially perpetuated through our culture and society as well. So you were thinking a little bit about characters with ALN, SEN or disability, and interesting potentially in terms of some of those kind of newer characters or newer programs like The Good Doctor, for example, where maybe there is now a change in that perception, where some of those characters have moved away from that more traditional disabled villain stereotype to potentially being the main character, and those differences that they display being shown as strengths. So in particular, shown in The Good Doctor, for example, yes, it does talk about him being autistic, for example, and lacking some of those social cues, but seeing things differently. But again, there's a few things that come right across some of those characters there in terms of that being underestimated. Okay, people maybe having lesser expectations of. Again, underestimated in terms of Sloth from the Goonies, for example. Being seen as a danger or needing constant support or being unfit to live independently. So some of these stereotypes still come through, but maybe we are starting to see a little bit more of a positive difference in terms of how some of these characters are portrayed, which potentially then may well have a positive impact upon how people are viewed within society. So thank you very much for sharing those. Again, apologies, a little bit of a recap again from last year. Realistically, we talked about the fact that there were all sorts of different models which impacted upon how people were perceived. The main one then was the medical model, and we came across this picture before when we talked about Crippen, for example, as a cartoonist who's done all sorts of disability-friendly kind of artwork and pushing a message across. And we said this one really kind of showed that well-meaning, polite society, that person being quite well-meaning but also quite condescending, so what's the matter with you? And then the person going, well, there's nothing the matter with me other than your attitude and the barriers that are in my way. So kind of shows, I think, that kind of medical and social model within the same kind of slide. And again, we mentioned this at the start, the medical model then very much focused upon deficit, very much focused upon what a person can't do, very limiting in terms of expectations and aspirations. And again, I quite like this slide here in terms of the problem being located within the individual, and again, focusing on deficit. So this, as a child, is going to be an adult who is not able to work. Something is faulty or damaged with them in some way, they can't access society, they've got something wrong with them, and because of that we need to medicate or support or care or do things on their behalf. Social model then, I kind of flipped that a little bit and talked about the fact that yes, somebody might have that individual difference, however, difference is just a difference. It only becomes disabling when society puts those barriers in place. And in particular, we've talked a lot before about the impact of attitudes in particular and perceptions, and how we perceive has a big impact. Also probably come across this previously as well, the charity model. So maybe Sloth from the Goonies and Lenny from Mice and Men, for example, the characters on that Padlet that you shared earlier on fit in very well in terms of this model. They need pity, they need charity, we need to do things for them. They're dependent, they're helpless, they're a burden, they can't contribute to society, so why should we support them through education, for example? Those perceptions then are important for children in terms of expectations and impacts. And again, we've come across things like the teacher expectancy effect before, or the Pygmalion effect. Quite interesting. For example, I was at an open day on campus back in November, and one of the potential students was talking at the end, and she went, "I don't really know why I've come today, because my deputy head in school has told me there's no point in me going to apply for university because they know I'm not going to get the grades to get there." Okay, which I thought was a bit sad really, in terms of, well, that person doesn't know, they think that, but potentially the fact that they think that and they verbalise that and they've shared that with the learner could lead to that being the actual result of that. So important to consider that kind of impact of teacher expectancy. Do we perceive learners with needs or disability as different, or do we perceive them as lesser? Does that mean we have lesser expectations and aspirations for that learner? Do we potentially put those into practice in the way that we engage with that person? Do you know what, that person is dyslexic, there's no point in putting them through their higher level literacy exams, for example. We'll just put them in for the lower level GCSE. Does that limit potentially where that learner goes in the future? This learner can't sit still in class, there's no point in giving them formal work the same as everyone else, let's just give them some colouring in to do to keep them busy and keep them quiet, for example. Does that impact upon the learner's outcomes and expectations? And then we've also looked at things before like self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you are viewed negatively by others, potentially you internalise that, and it gets to the point where, well, do you know what, everyone thinks that I'm incapable, so why should I bother trying? Because you don't bother trying, potentially those negative impacts come to be, and it's not because of those needs, but it's because those perceptions have been internalised. Just going to spend a few minutes talking about this. Where do we kind of put learners and how do we group learners? And then I'm going to set you off on a final task for this morning, which is a bit more of kind of an international comparison of perceptions and practices. Okay. So one of the things that does have a big impact in terms of learners' experiences and outcomes and aspirations and expectations is how in schools we group learners together. And realistically, we group learners in schools in a number of different ways. So the most obvious one is we group learners in terms of age. So if you were born between the 1st of September and the 31st of August the year after, then you will be in the same year group based upon when you were born. So my birthday is the 27th of August. I was the youngest person in my year group. If I was born a week later, I'd have been the oldest person in the group below mine, for example. So we group learners as a result of age in many ways, but also we can think about whether we group learners in terms of ability. And in school, especially common in primary school, we have mixed ability groups. So those learners are together in class because they happen to be born within that same 12-month period. And then potentially as we move into secondary school, we start to see a little bit more in terms of ability grouping. Or potentially we see this more in terms of certain subjects. So I know we're moving away from kind of siloed subjects in secondary school, but again, potentially we see patterns where we are putting learners into ability groups for literacy or numeracy or science sessions compared to mixed ability groups in terms of humanities, for example. So why do we do that with learners and what impact does that have? And one of the key things that kind of comes out in all sorts of different research is learners with additional learning needs, special educational needs, disability, but also broader needs like having English as an additional language, for example, tend to be grouped in lower ability groups. And what we'll spend a few minutes thinking about, I suppose, is that appropriate, and what impact does that have on that learner? Okay. So a study done relatively recently, the last 3 or 4 years or so, in secondary schools in particular in South Wales, looked at what teachers thought about grouping learners, and also asked pupils in the schools as well what they thought about grouping as well and how it impacted upon them. And there were some things that came out of this study which probably are what you'd expect, and then maybe there were things that came out that were a little bit less expected, but also tell their own story, for example. So one of the key things that came out of this study talked about the fact that most teachers within the study had a real strong belief that ability grouping was the right way to go. And in particular, ability grouping was appropriate in certain subjects. And they felt that it supported them in terms of teaching and delivering the curriculum. And they also suggested that having learners in the same class who were of a similar ability to each other would potentially build their confidence and self-esteem. So the argument that they kind of put against mixed ability grouping was, if you were in a mixed ability class, you will have that whole range of ability within the classroom, and maybe that visibility of that difference can impact upon some learners negatively. So if the person sitting next to you has answered 24 questions by the time you've read the first one, for example, does that impact upon your self-confidence and the self-esteem in the classroom? Learners, perhaps to some extent a little bit unexpectedly, were also quite happy about the fact that classes were grouped in terms of attainment. And even those learners who were seen as being and knew they were in lower attaining or lower ability groups were also quite happy with that as well. And they were happy in terms of the fact that they felt they had more support. So it wasn't all rosy, but they did recognise that potentially being in this class that's seen as being lower ability, I get more support, which helps me with my learning. However, a couple of the challenges they felt was the 2 points at the bottom of the slide. There was that lack of movement between groups. So it was quite common in secondary schools, for example, that learner in year 7, so just moved up from primary school, had been put into a lower ability group, and regardless of how well or not they achieved through year 7, year 8, year 9, potentially stayed in that group all the way through their experience in school. So once some of these learners were in these lower ability sets, they were almost trapped in those sets, and they found it very difficult to move up from those. Okay, so learners were kind of going, well, actually, do you know what, I'm doing better than I expected in the class, which is great, but I don't think I need to be in that class anymore, so why don't I get the opportunity to work my way up those different sets? There was also challenges in terms of, do you know what, a learner might be in a lower ability set because they had a challenge with literacy, which didn't impact upon other aspects of learning. However, they were put in lower ability sets for everything. So maybe that's a result of, do you know what, it makes it easier for schools to timetable rather than being the most appropriate provision for learners. And a key one, which again I suppose doesn't come as a shock at all, despite the fact that learners in these lower ability classes felt that the support they got was good, they were very aware that there was negativity and stigma attached to being in those classes. So I'm happy that I'm in that class because I get better help from the teacher, but other kids in school call me thick because I'm in the thick class, was some of the kind of the comments that came out. So there may be possible advantages and disadvantages in terms of that. Now, just got a few points and quotes again to illustrate this a little bit further. So we said then teachers were quite supportive of having these different ability groups, and they felt that lower ability groups were supportive because they tended to be smaller in size. So you might have 35 pupils in set 1, the top set, for example, but we might be looking at somewhere between 10 and 20 in that bottom set. So potentially having less children in that class made it easier for teachers to spend more time supporting those learners individually or in small groups. Okay, they also talked about the fact that even within different sets, the level and range of ability was huge. Okay, so there's quite a long quote on here which I won't read through from a maths teacher, for example, talking about the fact that in the year group that they worked with, the levels of ability in maths were so great that it was almost impossible to teach maths to everyone in mixed ability groups. So if they put learners into sets, then it was kind of easier to chunk up and support the teaching of maths. Teachers also felt that these groups were helpful in terms of supporting social development and emotional development, as well as academics. Okay, so in particular, do you know what, this learner now may be at the top end of a bottom set, which made them feel better about their abilities compared to other peers, compared to being the bottom person in the top set, if that makes sense. So that relative position within sets maybe was seen as supporting self-esteem. There were issues that the teachers noted as well, in particular in terms of stigma. Okay, so I think this is quite a telling quote from one of the secondary teachers. They don't like it being in the lowest set. It is an issue. There is a stigma, definitely. They know it's the bottom set, and they do say, oh, we're in the thick group or things like that. So yes, it is a disadvantage. It doesn't help with self-esteem, and it doesn't help with morale. So on the previous slide, teachers were talking about the fact that being in these lower ability groups was good, and it was positive, and it was supporting children, and it was making them feel more self-confident and better about themselves. Yet on the next slide, totally contradicting themselves in terms of some parts of it as well. Okay, so yes, the work might be more appropriate, but you know what, there's a stigma of being there. And those of you that have been in schools recently, and you've all been pupils in schools far more recently than I have, very often schools are quite creative in terms of how they name sets these days. So it's not set 1, which is the top, and set 5 is the bottom, for example. However, learners, I think, instinctively know which set they're in. So even if the bottom set 5 is called the rainbow room, you still know what that means instinctively. So there is that kind of stigma attached, that otherness, that being different in some way. Again, this is what some of the children that were interviewed talked about. Okay, so the children, as we said, liked having the support, but it came at a cost. Within a low set, we get called names because of it. It's not very nice. Other people see that they are up on you because they are in different classes. Or we get called names, and these were the ones that we came up with: dull, dumb, weirdos, or we're not in the clever class. And I think this is quite interesting at the bottom from one of the learners. This was a 12-year-old girl that was being interviewed, and she talked about the fact, I don't like teachers showing who is intelligent and who is not intelligent. Okay, so she felt very much that being in a set class kind of showed her relative intelligence position compared to other children. Okay, and I think it comes across that she was quite cross about how that made her feel. So kind of a mixed study, this one, in terms of whether there was support, whether it was an advantage, whether it was a disadvantage. This is what the learners in the study, there were about 60, I think, that were interviewed. This is what they wanted teachers to know. So in terms of how they were grouped in school, what they wanted was the support that came from being in different ability groups, so maybe work being more tailored to their academic level, or maybe the support is given in a different way, or maybe class sizes were smaller, which meant it was easier to get support quickly. So they enjoyed those bits. They also thought being in smaller classes was good, but it made them very worried about actually if they did do well, would they then go back into a bigger class? And for some learners that was a barrier. So we talked a little bit about risk and resilience earlier on in terms of labels, for example. So does putting learners into a lower ability class, does that support their resilience? They're doing well in that group. Does it actually lead to some risk in terms of not wanting to leave that kind of safe cocoon small class? Does that have a risk in terms of those children moving on from education? And then the final one, potentially, was in terms of sense of belonging. Okay, so thinking about what we looked at last year in terms of inclusion, that was perhaps a key feature. So I'm going to give you a break from my voice for the next 15 minutes or so, and there's a couple of things I'm going to ask you to do if you don't mind. Okay, and again, apologies with the Padlets this morning. But we've mentioned kind of briefly what perspectives and perceptions look like in the UK, possibly thinking about how you're perceived in society. If you have a need or a disability, does that help or hinder you? Are you a child in 2026 who has an additional learning need? Would you have been a child in 1936 who was irredeemably dull, for example? So have things changed for the better or not? Now what I'm going to ask you to do, and you can use Copilot or ChatGPT to help you with this if you want to, in terms of, I'm giving you 15 minutes roughly to do this. What I'd like you to do is think about how practice looks in different countries in terms of attitudes and approaches to ALN or SEN, and how that impacts upon children and childhood. So I've put a range of countries up on the board. There's one I forgot to put up, which was Canada. So realistically, what I've tried to do is take countries from different parts of the world. So we've got North America, South America, Europe, Asia and Africa, for example. And hopefully what we're going to get to towards the end of this morning is some kind of comparison of how perceptions towards ALN, how approaches towards ALN are either similar or different in different parts of the world, and how does that impact upon children and childhood depending upon where people live. So very often we talk about things like the postcode lottery, for example, in the UK. So if you happen to live in this street in Cardiff compared to that street in that part of Cardiff, how different does your life become as a result of kind of an accident of birth, realistically, in terms of where you live, in terms of what support and opportunities are available to you. So we also see those things on a global scale. Okay, so there are 10 countries, I think, as I said, I've forgotten to put Canada on. What I'd like you to do is to pick one of those countries, and hopefully people are going to pick different ones. So it might be easier if I kind of told you which ones I want you to do so that we don't have any crossover. Would people be happy if I said, would you mind looking at these? Would that be okay? Okay, so back row, are you happy to look at China? Okay, so second row from the back, between you, if you're happy to look at India and Ghana, would that be okay? Okay, three of you in kind of the row in front, if you're happy to do Nigeria and Jordan, if that's all right. Group in front, you've got Iceland and Portugal, and then cluster over there, are you happy to look at Argentina and Ecuador, please? Okay, and then if any group does finish quickly, maybe somebody might want to take a look at Canada as well. So what I want you to do first of all is just to kind of gather some information, and as I said, you can use AI to help with this if you want to, in terms of kind of cutting down time. But realistically, if you were a child living in China or India or Ghana or Nigeria, for example, how might ALN, SEN disability be perceived in that country? How then might that impact upon you, is what I'm asking you to take a look at. So I don't know why I did this as complicated as I did. It made sense when I put it together, but I don't know if it does anymore. So I've put two Padlets on here that I'm going to ask you to post something slightly different to. The first Padlet then is the one that you've already been using. And basically what I want you to do on here, under that third row, is basically what are the kind of the key features that you can find about how ALN, SEN disability is perceived in those countries. I've also put another Padlet up, which is this one. And this one looks a little bit more complicated, because it is. But what I've done on here, I've put on Wales as a comparison. And you can see I've put a number of columns on this. So I've introduced very briefly policy in Wales. I've mentioned briefly what the literature says about attitudes towards ALN. I've mentioned briefly about approaches, so all learners with ALN in Wales get an IDP, for example. Mentioned briefly what some of the barriers are, so we still don't have enough training or resources in Wales. And then I've also tried to link here, putting all that together, if you are a child with an additional learning need in Wales, how does that impact upon you and your childhood? And potentially what comes out is the legislation, the approaches, the attitudes are at least meaning to be inclusive. And thinking about things we looked at last year, about person-centred practice and the voice of the child, for example, there is that expectation that you are listened to and have that say in what happens to your life, rather than comparing to Lenny from Mice and Men, which that group noted, was seen as being incapable and needed care, for example. So what I'd like you to do, as I said, a little bit complicated. On that first Padlet, can you basically, technical term, just throw some stuff up on there in terms of what you find out about the particular countries you're looking at, in terms of how ALN is perceived, approaches. And then on this second Padlet, what we've got then is a column in different colours for each of those countries. So we've got Wales in red, China came next, which you can see is in the yellow, India came next, which is in the green. And what I'd like us to try and get to at the end of this is have a kind of table going across here, which looks a bit like the Wales one, which kind of would let us compare and contrast how things look in different countries. So if, for example, when you are looking at the second assignment for Michelle, if you were looking at how different aspects of childhood compare globally, then if you wanted to follow the ALN or disability route, for example, this might be a really useful table to refer back to in terms of key features of our practice in different parts of the world. Hopefully that makes sense. That made sense in my head when I was planning it the other day. Don't know if it still does this morning. Hopefully it does. So I'm going to shut up. It's 12:35. I will let you go on time at 12:50. So I'll give you about 12-13 minutes or so to see what you can pop up, and then hopefully towards the end of that time we will have this comparison table we can refer back to. Okay? Any questions, just ask. I will pause the recording whilst you're doing that. Okay, so thank you very much for sharing so far. We're just coming into the last 5 minutes or so. So I just wanted to again say thank you for posting on to either or both of those Padlets so far. What we tried to think a little bit this morning then is how maybe ALN or perceptions of ALN or disability might impact upon a child and their childhood and their opportunities in terms of where they're taught, how they're taught, expectations and aspirations, how society perceives and perpetuates those different views of need, for example. And then I was just going to spend a moment or so looking at that very final table on the Padlet there, or the very final column, the impact on children and childhood. So as we saw that in Wales, potentially that inclusive focus, children have a voice, but maybe there's inconsistencies in practice. And then if we just have a quick scroll down, those that have been filled in so far. So thinking about India, for example, a really interesting point about that kind of multi-generational living in terms of family structures. Potentially there are different challenges or resources in cities compared to urban areas. In terms of Ghana, for example, that's a really interesting one. Nearly 30% of children with disabilities do not attend school in Ghana, and the support is kind of spiritual rather than academic in terms of what children and families are signposted to. Thinking about Nigeria, so thank you for posting this. So those different levels of poverty and inequality, for example, cultural beliefs in terms of disability and needs, maybe some children don't need or shouldn't go to school, seen as still being appropriate as a result of the difference. Portugal, thank you very much. So Portugal seen as being one of the most inclusive education systems anywhere in the world in recent years. However, still that challenges in practice, potentially in terms of early school leaving rate is higher for children with disabilities compared to those without. So despite the fact that there is that focus on inclusion and removing that sense of difference and otherness, in practice potentially that still plays out to some extent. And then Ecuador, maybe children are given work that's inappropriate to their needs, maybe they miss out on support, potentially they fall behind, and that can have a positive, that can have a lifelong permanent impact. So thank you very much for posting what you've been able to do in the short period of time I've given you to do that. So just as we get into the final couple of minutes then, just wanted to mention a couple of things really, and maybe we saw some of this to some extent in terms of those kind of characters from media and literature. So very often and traditionally we've had that focus on deficit. Are we now starting to see more of a focus on positivity or potential positive traits linked to different areas of need? And talking about the fact of superpowers, for example. So it's not uncommon to go to schools and see posters talking about my dyslexic superpower rather than my dyslexic deficit. So trying to focus more on the strengths of those differences rather than focusing on the deficit. So maybe we see that with the lead character in The Good Doctor, for example, thinking about the strengths he has that his condition brings. So maybe we are seeing more of a positive view. However, I was just going to finish off on this point really. Has anyone come across the work of Tom Shakespeare previously? So Tom Shakespeare is a disability activist, and I thought his work was quite interesting really in terms of potentially what we've had in relation to disability in ALN and SEN has been that move away from medical to social, that move towards focusing on positive aspects, that move towards focusing on kind of perceived superpowers, for example. However, Tom Shakespeare looks at this from a different extent again, and he talks about actually what we need to do is rather than moving towards focusing on the positives of difference, maybe what we need to do is stop thinking about those differences at all. And maybe what we should be doing, rather than separating people out by taking pride in or celebrating particular aspects of an area of need, maybe what we should be doing is making those needs irrelevant and removing those from the conversation, which I think is an interesting point to finish off on possibly. So, I did say I'd stop talking at 12:50, it's 12:52, so before we go, thank you very much for coming in this morning. Hopefully there's been something that might be useful. If not, at least it's got you out of the house for a couple of hours on a really nice day. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces this afternoon. You've only, as you said, got a few months left before you come to the end of your time potentially in Swansea, which is quite scary but also really exciting in terms of thinking about next steps as well. So whatever next steps take you moving forward, I wish you every success with where you go next. And if there is anything I can help with between now and the end of your studies, or anything I can help with in the future, then please just get in touch. So have a great rest of your week, good luck with the rest of your studies, and I wish you every success moving forward.
Thank you very much.